Welcome to this Marginalia Review of Books podcast. I'm delighted to welcome our special guest, Dr. Daniel Joslyn-Siemiatkoski, who's the Kraft Family Professor and Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. Professor Siemiatkoski is one of the leading scholars of Jewish Christian relations and comparative theology, and he's the author of The More Torah, The More Life, a Christian commentary on Mishnah Avot and Christian memories of the Maccabean martyrs. His research interests include Jewish-Christian relations, ancient and modern, comparative theology, and the intersection of anti-Judaism and racism, as well as Anglican theologies of religion. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Siemiatkoski today, not only to discuss his special work, but also the very special significance it has for the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, the most significant Christian evolution in Christian-Jewish relations, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary this October. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Could you help explain sort of your work to an audience who maybe isn't familiar with the world of Christian Jewish learning or the significance even of theology? A lot of people think that theology is something just for Christians or people who have religious beliefs, and they often don't understand the sort of broader significance of theology, even for the secular world.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I direct this center focused on Christian Jewish relations at Boston College. There's a number of these centers that exist at universities and colleges across North America and in other parts of the world, especially in Europe, academic centers. These were established in the wake of the Second World War and the Holocaust as a way of asking, how can Christianity begin to account for its complicity in anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and the reality that the Holocaust happened in nominally Christian lands. And so I think that backstory to my center, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, speaks to that question: what does theology have to do with the modern world? Theology is a way of thinking through genealogies of relationship between peoples in Christian areas. It's a way of thinking through meaning making, thinking through truth claims, thinking through questions of what standards of morality, ethics, and justice need to play out today.
Well, that's incredibly interesting and helpful. The idea of theology is, first of all, a sort of genealogy of sort of the relationships between peoples, and in a sense of the broader genealogy of our values in the modern world. So if we could start just with the first thing you mentioned, I think there's, you mentioned, right, the Christian background or even in complicity in anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Can you give a brief overview of what we know as scholars about that? Because it's obviously an issue on which you could say there's a very different degree of awareness. Jewish people are obviously much more aware of the role of Christianity in anti-Semitism. Many Christians have a much more difficult time, maybe because of a lack of education, which the center you direct, of course, is part of helping people with that, understanding that role, and can often even be uncomfortable. So how could you help us understand what is the Christian role in anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, particularly, for example, with the Shoah or the Holocaust? And is there a particular approach that you use as an educational leader and teacher to help students who might be coming from Christian backgrounds, for example, think about that in a way that doesn't threaten them, but also exposes them to what we know as the scholarly truth?
Yeah, so it's, that course is an entire semester worth.
Exactly. You got 5 minutes now.
So let me put it this way. I actually teach a course called Christianity and Judaism in Dialogue that fulfills one of the theology requirements at Boston College. We have 2 theology requirements for all undergraduates. And I'm actually just finishing up the first half of that course, which is simply looking at what we might call the master stories or master narratives of Judaism and Christianity. That is, what are the narratives that animate each tradition? And so we look at the story of Exodus and the life of Jesus through the lens of the Gospel of Matthew. One of the things that's really useful about that is the way in which Matthew kind of really calls upon the Exodus master narrative to shape the story of that gospel. And so we already see that there's this kind of inherent connection, even though there's significant divergences around the person of Jesus between Jews and Christians, that there's also a calling upon an understanding of the same God is behind these actions for both communities as a shared way of looking at scriptural narrative. But there's divergences. And so the second half of the semester I teach with my students is to say, how do those divergences come about, and why is it that Christianity turns towards a way of engaging with Judaism in which Judaism becomes the other that Christianity defines itself against? When we think about the problems of marginalizing and oppressing people in Western cultures and societies, I argue that the genealogy of that goes back to a kind of original Christian anti-Judaism. The scholar David Nirenberg, who's now at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, wrote a book called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, where he talks about how Christianity uses the figure of the Jew to think with, that is, to define itself in terms of, but the Jewish reality is never engaged with as a subject, but always as an object. And so this way of making the other happens very early in Christianity. We begin finding it in figures like Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century. Really concretized in 4th and 5th centuries with figures like John Chrysostom and Augustine of Hippo. That process of self-differentiation takes some time, but we can really see it concretized by the 4th century. And that develops what we call a theological legacy of anti-Judaism. That Judaism is that which has passed away. It represents something inferior, weak, temporary, carnal, and that Christianity is that which is eternal, of the spirit, universal, these sorts of concepts. That legacy of theological anti-Judaism is what begins to undergird what scholars identify as anti-Semitism as well, which is a way of biologizing, we could say, racializing the Jewish people. We see that dynamic actually unfolding starting in the middle of the 13th century, and further coming about in things like the blood purity laws that is developed in Spain during the Inquisition in the 15th and 16th centuries. And then with this kind of new racialized discourse that emerges in 19th century anthropological and pseudoscientific enterprises. There's a racializing of Judaism as that which is inherently inferior to European races. And sometimes it's easy to say, well, Christianity is anti-Jewish and something like Nazism is anti-Semitic. That sometimes can release some blame for Christian apologists. But I think it's more coherent to see how these are kind of organic developments and one depends on the other. And it's really difficult to actually extricate Christian anti-Judaism from the racialized anti-Semitisms of the 19th and 20th century, which is why these genealogies of relationship are so important to investigate.
Right. They are crucially important. I was thinking of an example of the anti-Judaism from Nuremberg's work, where he talks about Immanuel Kant, who many people will know as one of the great Enlightenment philosophers. Mm-hmm. And there's a great deal of controversy. Nuremberg discusses it because Kant is representative in many ways of the Enlightenment tradition in having this exactly very Christian view of the inferiority of Judaism as historical, as opposed to sort of his philosophy, which is a kind of secularized Christianity as eternal. And he speaks of the need for a euthanasia of Judaism, which is not necessarily a call for the genocide as we now hear it after the Shoah, but is very reflective of this tradition, which stretches all the way from the 2nd century up to the present, we obviously now confront a terrible upsurge of anti-Semitism on both the left and the right. And in fact, the sort of right wing mainstreaming of anti Semitism in American discourse is extremely concerning. How would you do you see that as a direct connection to this anti Christian, the Christian anti Judaic legacy in the contemporary anti Semitism? A lot of people will just say it's a cultural phenomenon. But I think a big stress of your own work and scholars who work in the theological background is exactly as you said, that anti-Semitism is actually not really fully detachable from the Christian context in which it emerged and was
Yeah,
racialized.
yeah. One of the really good examples of this, and let's just stay on this question of kind of the phenomenon of the United States on the right, and I'm happy to talk about the phenomenon of in the United States and globally on the left as well. But there's something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. It's shorthand as IRA for the acronym. And one of the elements of it is to not basically portray Jews as responsible for death of Jesus or things that cast them in a negative religious light. And this really ties into what we're going to talk about with Nostra Aetate later. And there was a proposal to basically enshrine the IRA definition as kind of something that the United States signs on to and gets tied into elements of anti-discrimination law in the United States. Last year, this was going to be voted on in Congress, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a very strong figure in sort of far-right discourses in the MAGA world, but an interesting critic of MAGA as well at times that we maybe don't need to get into. She and some other people in her caucus really objected to this provision of the IRA definition because it said this requires us to deny scripture in which it's clear that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. And so this desire to hold on to what we call the deicide charge, even though one had assumed that in mainstream American Christian culture, this deicide charge had ebbed away, we see its resurgence in far-right circles. The flip side of that on the left around, say, anti-Zionist discourse is the shifting of the deicide charge into something more like there's something within Jewishness that is inherently aggressive, murderous, harms the innocent. And so Jesus as the ideal innocent figure gets shifted onto other innocents that elements of Judaism, especially Zionism, can do nothing but become perpetrators of harm to innocents.
It's a powerful and alarming resurgence of the legacy. If you were to summarize for a person who doesn't, and I think a lot of even Christians today don't know this, like Catholics, for example, because it's been taken out of the liturgy. We talk about the deicide charge. This is the charge that has been leveled against Jews for, almost 2,000 years and justified terrible acts of violence throughout history in Christian lands that they killed God on the understanding that Jesus was not only the Son of God, but was divine. And so the idea of deicide is this, in a sense, it's the imputation to Jews of a literally almost unimaginable crime. A crime
Right.
whose very theological intelligibility is like linked to Christians' unique idea of the incarnation, that you can somehow attack God through the person of Jesus. And this was part of the liturgy. It was read annually in
Yeah.
certain very influential services in, for example, the Roman Catholic Church. So if a person has no exposure to that, could you just give a brief summary from the standpoint of that traditional perspective of, what is the logic? You just elaborated on it, that Jesus sort of becomes this innocent figure. But for someone like this congresswoman, what is the logic of thinking still that we need this? I think it's a very concerning thing that people think this, and I think Christians would even feel often slandered if they were told that they think this, and yet here we have it back in our
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting problem. Like, why do we need this concept of deicide or of I think there's a sort of oppositional logic in Christianity. A colleague of mine, Philip Cunningham, who directs the Institute for Catholic Jewish Relations at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, has coined the term the oppositional imagination. And I think this is really a helpful heuristic device, that there's something in Christianity that encounters Judaism as the negative against which Christianity is defined positively. My hunch in this is part of the reason why this occurs is because the core element of Christianity, the text of texts, is the four canonical gospels. And they are narratives. Any good narrative as a plot depends on conflict and resolution of conflict. That's what makes the story interesting. And the conflict that gets embedded tends not to be the conflict of Jesus with Rome, but rather the conflict of Jesus with fellow Jews, Pharisees, scribes, temple leaders. Even though we as scholars of the Gospels could say, this is an intra-Jewish debate. This would not be unlike we read a novel about contemporary American public life, and we could see an intra-American debate. But when Christianity becomes more of a Gentile movement, that intra-Jewish element gets lost, and then it seems to be Jesus against the Jews versus Jesus the Jew against another set of Jews. So that oppositional narrative then elevates Jesus above Judaism. And we have some really unfortunate texts from scriptures that do this kind of work. One is the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44, where Jesus is debating with the Jews, and Jesus declares his opponents to be children of the devil. Okay. We also have in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, I'm reading this now, verse 23. This is Peter's discourse on the day of Pentecost when he's preaching to the people in Jerusalem. And he says, this man, Jesus, handed over to you according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of those outside the law. So Jesus is Peter speaking to the residents of Jerusalem and says, you've killed Jesus and you handed him over to the Romans. And so it's that kind of a New Testament passage that various Republican representatives said, no, this is in Scripture, that this happened. And so, but then that gets elevated to, again, Jesus versus Judaism, Christians versus Jews, Christians as righteous followers of Jesus, Jews as those who have blood on their hands. And so I think there's an oppositional logic at play in the core texts that then gets utilized to create this oppositional rhetoric between Christianity and Judaism. And I think this feeds into a wider phenomenon we could discuss also, which is Christian supremacy. That Christianity is at the top of the spiritual and social and political pyramids in Western thought. And this goes back to some of what we were discussing with David Nirenberg's thesis in his book, Anti-Judaism.
Right. And so, yeah, I think we should discuss that. I think maybe one way to get into that issue of Christian supremacism is to ask you, and I'll share my own thoughts. I know we both are aware of the scholarship on this, whether you think these readings of the text that take this oppositional logic, like in the passages you mentioned, whether these are actually accurate historical understandings of the Gospels. I mean, my view based on the scholarship is, of course, it's not. As you mentioned, Jesus is Jewish, all of his disciples were Jewish. The original movement associated with him was Jewish. We know they were Gentile converts, but I think the best scholarly understanding of that is, to me, there's like three important points that as I see it, there's a scholarly consensus on, but you can tell me if you agree with this consensus or how it plays out. One is that, as you mentioned in the beginning, there's a common pattern in Jewish literature, which is like it's an internal conflict. The prophets are often critiquing the nation of Israel from the standpoint of their failure to adhere to the law. And Jesus is
Right.
a completely Jewish figure, like Daniel Boyarin shows in the Jewish Gospels. Indeed, he seems extremely conversant with the Pharisaic debates of like the
Mhm.
school of Shammai and Hillel. And he says, I'm here to perfect the law, to consummate it. He says that my disciples have to have a perfection and righteousness greater even than the Pharisees. And so it would seem like, on the internal logic of the text, properly read, none of these passages should be read as actually about some gigantic group of all the Jews or of Judaism, but they're rather an internal critique of one Jewish group, of another Jewish group. In this case, for example, often the Sadducees, who as the sect who is in control of the temple, also was in the closest connection with Rome. They were concerned to preserve the peace of Judea as a Roman province. And that's connected to the second debate, which is that the terms we translate as Judaism, many scholars argue, should really be translated as Judean. That there's a specific regional concern. Marginalia published a very large form about this that we'll link
Yeah.
to. The people listening to this and reading it can see about this debate. And one of the reasons I think it matters, for example, Sarah Rudin, in her translation of the Gospels, she translates these terms as Judeans, that there were many, many Jews, of course, in many regions like Samaria and others. And Judeans in the Jerusalem leadership obviously had a role, of course, in anything that happened in their context. So, but the
Right.
idea that they stand in for all of Judaism, that's a claim that is foundational to this Christian, later anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic reading. And if you think that primarily this is an internal debate, an internal critique, that inside of that context, the second point being it's not a critique of all of Judaism or of
Right.
all of the Jews, then that would lead to sort of the third, I think, thing a lot of scholars think, which is that what's really going on is, if you think about what the Messiah is supposed to be, the Jewish messianic texts indicate that when the Messiah comes, there'll be a gathering in of all the nations. So the Gentiles will be brought into the covenant of Israel, and they'll recognize the true creator God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that is the context of the messianic movement in the first century. Many Jews don't agree that that figure is Jesus or Yeshua, but they would agree, broadly speaking, if you look at the Talmud, if you look at the Mishnah Torah of Maimonides, that when the Messiah comes, there will be a gathering of the nations. This is very clear in Isaiah. So that third point is crucial, that the texts are not about Christianity versus Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. The original movement of his disciples was a Jewish movement that existed inside of the context of the temple observance. The critiques are often focused on a particular group of ruling Jews, who many other Jewish groups, like the Essenes we know, also critiqued. And so, would you agree that that's a decent snapshot of kind of the broader scholarly
Yeah.
consensus?
Yeah.
How could we bring that to bear then on Christian supremacism? Is this something that all Christians are part of, or is it part of just this unfortunate logic, you could argue, that comes from misunderstanding the historical context of the text?
Right. So, yes, in broad strokes, what you say is true. And of course, there's full ranges of scholarly debate about various aspects of this. I think one of the things that's really interesting is with this Jewish, Judean question, how you translate this word. One of the anxieties that gets pointed out, though, of course, is that we have scholarship that came out in the 1930s under German Nazi theologians who were seeking to de-Judaize Jesus, and so they made this Judean distinction to say Jesus isn't a Jew at all, he's from the Galilee, and the Galilee was actually of a different ethnic composition, et cetera, et cetera. And so we could see quickly how even efforts to introduce nuance can get weaponized, which
Right.
goes to the logic of Christian supremacy, which is, why does Christianity feel the need to support priority over Judaism? And can we move from that oppositional logic to a different way of thinking about Christianity, which, if we follow the example of Jesus, I'm speaking now from a Christian theological perspective, we look at Paul's letter to the Philippians in the second chapter. He has this passage where he speaks about how Christ empties himself of his glory descends from the Father to do all humanity. That self-emptying is called kenosis. And one of the things I do in some of my writing is say, how could Christianity have a kenotic, a self-emptying disposition towards Judaism in which we don't seek to prioritize Christianity over Judaism, or even to say how Judaism itself ought to be defined, but always to defer back to Judaism for its own forms of self-definition, of its preferred modes of framing issues. Because there's a logic here of Christian supremacy that has a theological current, which is that Christ is not only God's chosen or God's Messiah, which in Judaism is God's special agent on earth to effect God's will, but rather Christ is God. Christ is cosmic savior. All of the cosmos is transformed because of Christ. So naturally then, Christ and anything that is associated with Christ has to be above anything else. The problem that comes into tension with Judaism, of course, is Judaism understands itself to have an eternal covenant with God. And so how do we put these two dynamics into place? The universal significance of Christ and this unique relationship that Judaism understands itself to have with the God of Jesus Christ. And so in order to move to that realm of recognizing these two things are in a dynamic relationship with each other would require a moving away from Christian supremacy. So instead of what we could say is a oppositional imagination that Christian supremacy feels, we would want to then, for Christianity, shift to what I call a covenantal imagination of recognizing the different ways in which covenantal realities exist. So covenant means a special way of making relationship between a people and God. So Israel's covenant. And then, as you reference, Isaiah's vision of all the nations streaming into relationship with God, that is the covenant Christ effects for the nations. That reading does a lot, I think, to move us away from some of these dynamics of Christian supremacy that is undergirded by anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism.